So, imagine you haven't eaten in 2 days. You're part of a small band of hunter-gatherers, and you already know exactly where the herd is. You tracked it yesterday. You found the prints? You mapped the whole route in your head, step by step. Now all that's left is getting there. Then it starts raining. Not a light drizzle, a heavy, soaking, wind-driven rain that just won't let up. It pours all day. Then all night? The next morning, it's still coming down hard. Now you cannot see tracks because the mud has swallowed every one of them. You cannot even move fast across open ground because wet stone under bare feet means a twisted ankle, and out here, a twisted ankle can mean death. The river near your camp is rising, inch by inch. The way a bathtub fills when nobody remembers the tap is still running. And the fire, the one thing keeping you warm, keeping predators at a distance, keeping you alive at all, is starting to gasp and smoke instead of burn. You would guess a week like that is just lost time. A pause button on your ancestors' entire existence, days when nothing happened, because nothing could happen. Except that assumption does not survive contact with the evidence. If rain truly erased days from human history, there should be nothing left behind from inside those days. So what actually happened inside that shelter? What did cold, hungry, trapped hands do with no hunt to run and nowhere to go? What did ancient humans build during the exact stretch of time a modern person would call a complete waste? The short answer is they were not bored. They were trapped, and the rain did not stop them. It started them. Start with the shelter itself, since that is what failed first. At Metzhirich, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bone, an age confirmed through radiocarbon studies published in the Journal of Human Evolution at roughly 15,000 years old. Not wood. Bone. On the open steppe, where a storm could roll in and sit for days without warning. Wood was scarce and unreliable, while stacked bone held its shape against real wind, not unlike a modern engineer choosing reinforced concrete over drywall in a flood zone. That is the first hard lesson this whole story runs on. Shelter that only blocked the sun was never enough. So shelter had to become engineering. Today you complain about a slow drip under your bathroom sink. Your ancestors were stacking skulls to keep an entire river out of their bedroom. Fire came next. Because a shelter without fire is just a cold box with better walls. A soaked week does not threaten your fire once. It threatens it every single hour. And losing it meant starting from nothing on a wet, moonless night with no dry tinder for miles, which could cost half a day. Nobody had to spare. That is exactly why Ötzi, the traveler whose frozen body was preserved in the Alps and radiocarbon dated in studies published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology at roughly 5,300 years old, was not only carrying flint and iron pyrite, a hard stone that throws a spark when struck against flint, when he died. He was also carrying a pouch of true tinder fungus, adense, dried fungus, that catches a spark and smolders for hours instead of burning out. Prepared well in advance, so fire could be restarted fast the moment it went out. That is not hunting gear. That is an insurance policy. The same way, losing your internet for an hour today can feel like a small crisis. Except this genuinely was one. Think of it as the ancient version of keeping a spare charger in every bag you own. Except losing this, one could cost the whole group its only heat. Hunger forced the next shift, and it bent the entire diet sideways. No tracks. No herd. No hunt. So the diet had to change completely. Research on modern foraging groups, including work associated with James O'Connell at the University of Utah, has long documented something called fallback foraging. That simply means the less preferred, harder to process foods, roots, tubers, insects, anything the rain itself made easier to dig out of softened ground, that a group turns to only once its preferred food disappears. None of it was glamorous. None of it was what anyone would choose on a good day, but it kept people alive on the bad ones. On the same shift from your favorite restaurant order to whatever is actually still open at midnight. Here is the part almost nobody expects. Once the fire finally steadied and the hunt stayed paused, hands still needed something to do. And that is where this story stops, being only about survival. At Abri du Maras, a rock shelter in France. Researchers led by Bruce Hardy at Kenyon College identified a fragment of twisted plant fiber cordage, meaning early rope, dated to somewhere between 41,000 and 52,000 years old. Picture one person sitting just inside the dry line of that shelter, running bark fiber between their fingers for hours, twisting each strand tight enough to hold, tight enough that none of it happened by accident. Not unlike how an earbud cord tangling in your pocket right now still only stays useful if it is twisted the right way. That is not a person waiting out bad weather. That is the invention of rope. And rope is what eventually lashes a spear point to a shaft, hauls a net, ties a shelter frame down against wind. Similar twisted fiber technology has since turned up at other prehistoric sites on more than one continent, which tells you this was not a lucky one-time accident. Not for hunting. Not for shelter. For string. The rain did not stop them. It started something new in their hands. Once your hands are busy, and your whole group is packed into one dry space for days, something starts happening that has nothing to do with tools at all. At Sunjur, a site in Russia dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, researcher Randall White of New York University has studied burials containing roughly 10,000 ivory beads, close to the number of grains in a large bag of rice, each one individually drilled and shaped by hand rather than mass-produced. Picture the person who drilled bead after bead after bead, hour after hour, adding almost nothing to that day's food supply. Whew. That kind of effort only makes sense if the beads were doing social work instead, marking status, marking, belonging, marking exactly who was tied to whom. The same quiet bonding a modern office runs through a group chat that never actually stops buzzing. You would guess that many people crammed together for days would fall apart into chaos. Mostly, they did not. That closeness raises the question you are probably already silently asking: what happened when a dozen people were packed into one space for days with no real privacy and nowhere else to go? The honest answer, based on both archaeological and ethnographic patterns, is refreshingly practical rather than dramatic. Waste was managed just outside the entrance. In one designated spot, the whole group understood without ever needing to discuss it. Not unlike the unspoken rule your own household already has about which bathroom door means occupied. Tension existed too, and it was managed through shared ritual, storytelling, and divided tasks rather than isolation. Not unlike how a long weekend snowed in with family suddenly makes a deck of cards feel essential, because isolation was never an option anyone could actually afford. That pressure, oddly enough, is where sound enters the story. At Jiahu, in China, work associated with archaeologist Garmin Harbottle of Brookhaven National Laboratory studied bone flutes dated to roughly 9,000 years old, with finger holes spaced within about 1 millimeter of each other, roughly the width of a paperclip's wire, precise enough to hold a consistent musical scale rather than produce random tones. A flute does not feed you. It does not warm you. Under ordinary conditions, it might never even occur to anyone to make one. But trapped, restless. and surrounded by people who also had no hunt to run, sound became the thing that filled the silence. Rain left behind. The same itch that makes a long car ride feel wrong, without a playlist going. Someone might reasonably ask how anyone can be confident that stone tools and old bones actually reveal behavior, rather than just being objects people are reading too much into. The same reasonable skepticism you would have toward a viral claim with no source attached. Faire question. The confidence comes from convergence, not guesswork. The same pattern, shelter engineered against water, fire carried as insurance, tools born from idle hands, ornaments tied to social bonding, keeps turning up across sites separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. In Ukraine, the Alps, France, Russia, and China. That kind of repetition across unrelated populations, continents apart, is what real scientific consensus actually looks like. Not one lucky find being overinterpreted. It is worth being honest here too. You might assume all of this made rainy weeks feel meaningful and almost peaceful. It did not. Infant mortality stayed high. A small wound could turn fatal within days, and a long enough storm sometimes meant real hunger. Not the mild inconvenience of a grocery order running late. Nothing about this period deserves to be romanticized into some cozier, simpler version of life. It was hard, and sometimes people did not survive it. One more piece of engineering closes out the pattern. At Monteverde, in Chile, researcher Tom Dillahay of Vanderbilt University documented hide-covered, tent-like structures dated to roughly 14,500 years old through radiocarbon studies published in the journal Science. Wooden tools found nearby were coated in a natural tar like mastic, a sticky, water-resistant plant resin. So, these groups were already experimenting with weatherproofing materials long before anyone had a word for it. Long before anyone could just order a tarp online and have it delivered by morning. Shelter became engineering. Fire became insurance. And idle, trapped hands built the rope, the ornaments, and the music that came right after. Here is the twist. Every single one of those pressures only existed because the weather refused to cooperate. One failure forced the next invention, which forced the next. Not unlike how a single power outage this week suddenly reveals how much of your day quietly depended on it. Until the very stretch of time that looked like an empty pause in survival turned out to be the exact window where technology, art, and cooperation actually had room to grow. Clear days were for chasing the herd. Trapped days were for building everything the species needed for the next 10,000 clear days that followed. The rain did not stop them. It built them piece by piece. You were never looking at wasted time. You were looking at the workshop. It is probably raining in Houston again tonight, too. For thousands of years, a week of hard rain forced your ancestors to build the tools, the bonds, and the sounds that carried the whole species forward. Now a week of rain just cancels a gym class and pushes back a dry cleaning pickup. Helen Keller once said, "Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet." And whether or not she had a mammoth bone house in mind, it is hard to find a more accurate description of what those trapped, storm-bound weeks actually built. The next time the rain will not stop and the whole day feels like it is stealing something from you, remember this. It never stopped your ancestors. It built them, and it is doing the exact same thing to you right now.